All right, let's talk about BYU football. Now, what we're going to do here is we're literally going to go season by season and kind of tell you the top moments from each season of BYU football history. They celebrate the 100th year of BYU football. So there's 99 seasons to count down in the coming months, and it's going to be a really, really fun endeavor. Going to take a lot of work for me to track down some of this information, but I am up for the task, and we started off today. Let's talk about BYU in 1922. Now, some of you may be aware that the University of Utah and BYU have a dispute on when their football series officially began. The University of Utah claims that 1896 was the first game that BYU and Utah played. BYU disputes that, saying 1922 was in fact the first time that the Utes and Cougars tussled on the gridiron. The reason for the discrepancy is that BYU up until 1903 was called Brigham Young Academy. It was a hybrid prep academy / high school, and BYU played football in the 1890s, 1892-ish to 1897, somewhere thereabouts, under the BYA flag. And as such, BYU, considering it was a prep academy at that point, not a full-fledged college / university, they don't consider that to be true intercollegiate athletics that BYU participated in. Alas, in 1900, there was a death, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, banned football from being played at church-owned universities, schools, and the like for nearly 20 years. It was that era. Many of you might recall Teddy Roosevelt is considered to be the guy that saved football from itself. There were deaths all the time, and it became like this it was a bad thing because they're having so many young men die on college campuses, and it caused a big uproar. And Congress was considering outlawing the game and making it something that you could not play. But Teddy Roosevelt got the heads of all the major football programs together and said, hey, we got to revamp the rules here. And as such, became a cleaner game, safer to a degree. And obviously it is kind of refined over time in this century plus since. But in 1919, BYU officially resumed playing football. Now, in 1919, it was, let's say, an intramural type program. 1920, BYU played a little bit of more games against other programs in the local area. Think of like they had what was once upon a time called the Crescents from the YMCA, the Wheel Club of Denver. Like there were some crazy teams that BYU played during this era. But then they had intercollegiate games that resuming in 1920 under Alvin Twitchell. And then they were admitted to the Rocky Mountain Conference in 1921, and their first season officially in the Rocky Mountain Conference was in 1922. Now, the first coach for BYU. This is a little bit of trivia for you guys. Some of you might know it, but BYU had Alvin Twitchell come in to take over at BYU. He was an all-conference tackle during his playing days at what was then Utah Agricultural College. You know it today as Utah State University. And then they spent the 1921 season playing with a young team, playing freshman teams from the other schools in the Rocky Mountain Conference. BYU had a 3-4 record that year against Utah State, Utah Agricultural College, and what was called the Ogden Athletic Association. Then, in the summer of 1921, leading in to the 22 season, Alvin Twitchell spent the summer working at Illinois, training and learning how to become a better head coach. Then came back to BYU and began the first intercollegiate season for BYU with the Cougars. Now, I want to talk about petty. You know how BYU and Utah State fans like to get after one another? Well, it goes back even to 1922. Now, the history of the Rocky Mountain Conference had suggested that new schools, the history of it, and it's pretty scant history at this point, 1922, is that BYU was a new program coming in. And previous to this, programs like Wyoming, who BYU would play in 1922, have been allowed to use freshman players when they made their debut in the conference. Not for BYU. According to some of the documents I read and the articles I read, both Utah and Utah State blocked the Rocky Mountain Conference from allowing BYU to play freshmen as a debut program. And, you know, rivalry exists in all things, and it existed here once again. Now, highlighted players that were members of the 1922 squad. The famed Boney Fuller, and many of you know him from social media. Yes, that is where Boney Fuller's legend began in 1922. His formal name is Lavonia Fuller. He was a kid from Tintic High School. Now, if anybody know where Tintic High School is, it's in Eureka, Utah, in the remote southwest corner of Utah County. And he came to BYU as BYU's quarterback that season. Also, I have maybe a relative on on this squad. Victor Hatch played for BYU in 1922. I don't know if I have a direct relation. I have to do some digging on that. But BYU began the 22 season with hopes that they would be able to surprise some folks. But the biggest thing is that BYU found out very quickly it's very hard to break into intercollegiate athletics, especially against programs who have got decades of experience up to that point. Both Utah State and Utah, excuse me, were BYU's first two opponents. Now, Utah State played their first game of intercollegiate football in 1892. They took a couple of years off and they resumed play in 1896 and had played all the way through that up until BYU's debut here in the 1922 season. Utah also started in the 1890s and been playing football ever since. So they're well-established programs, probably with more established players, but BYU lost their opener to Utah State 42-3, then followed that up by getting smoked by Utah 49-0. So officially in BYU's record book, the Cougars 0-1 against both the Aggies and the Utes in their first season of college football. They ended up then losing 47-0 to Colorado School of Mines. So really, really tough debut for BYU. They scored in their debut 3 points, but since that point have been shut out. But following that, BYU marked their first ever win in program history with a 7-0 shutout of Wyoming at home, with Captain Paul Packard coming on as a sub in that game and hooking up with Hunter Manson for a 25-yard touchdown that proved to be the difference in this game. So if anybody ever gets into I don't know what I'm trying to say, a trivia thing, and they say, who is the first BYU Cougar to have scored a touchdown in program history? Hunter Manson is the name to know if you want to win that award, and people will be stunned that you know that. But then following that win, BYU feeling good about themselves, and they're now 1-4 on the season. Well, they're after the season with a 33-0 shutout loss at Colorado State, and then had a rematch against Wyoming in Laramie that, according to the documents about this game, featured several inches of snow on the field. Who would have thought going to Laramie in November would have been a bad idea? And BYU got shut out once again, 13-0 to close their debut season. A grand total of 1 win against 5 losses. And let's just put it this way, the point differential, not pretty. 10 points scored on the season against 184 given up. So, really, really tough times for BYU. And then going back, the final note I probably should mention here is that BYU probably would have liked to have had their freshmen available for the season. But once again, when Utah State and Utah blocked that for the Rocky Mountain Conference, which I still can't get over the fact that even in 1922, those two programs were playing games with the Cougars. But BYU's freshman squad that season apparently was fairly strong because the varsity program was shut out 13-0 by BYU's freshman team in an intra-squad scrimmage leading up to their official debut that season. So if you want to add that shutout by the BYU freshman squad, it ends up with 10 points scored against 197 points given up. So tough scenes for BYU as they made their debut as a football program. But as I say, when you're as low as BYU was in 1922, there's really nowhere to go but up. And we will talk tomorrow more about BYU in 1923 and give you a little more of the history, as get you a little more for a feel of. Really, it's kind of 50 years of crap that BYU waded through, and then 50 years of glory. And I think many of you know when that 50 years of glory may have begun, but it was 1972. But we'll wind our way. We got another 49 seasons to go before we get to the head coaching debut of Lavelle Edwards, and we'll have some fun along the way. We'll get you a little more in terms of the context and understand what the history of BYU football has been. Where they were and where they are today are two very, very different places. And it all began once again in 1922.